Welcome at Week Zero. As you might have seen over the weekend, there have been severe riots in the UK as there is a mass protest against the current migration policies. And to get a better understanding with us today is Joseph Robertson. He's a political strategist and a former journalist. Joseph, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Scarlett. And yeah, interesting times in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, even so far that Elon Musk said that it's on the verge of having a civil war. First of all, what is going on, Joseph?
Yeah, so this isn't something that's just happened overnight. This is something that's been building ever since the Blair government, really, when the start of mass migration was heralded. We've seen a lot of issues, a lot of tensions with cultures coming into this country who are not necessarily willing to assimilate. And of course, that tension has been stirred further by the stabbing recently of a military individual, a soldier who stood outside his barracks, was stabbed in the back by an immigrant. And then more recently, the son of immigrants, who, of course, committed a tragedy by killing three young girls. And of course, this has brought things to a tipping point. For a long time, people have been talking about no-go zones. They've been talking about areas in the UK that are no longer safe because of migrants who are not assimilated with the general population. And of course, this is a crisis that is in part escalated by the sheer size of the amount of immigration we've got in this country at the moment. There is just not the capable infrastructure really to allow migrants to assimilate properly. And these tensions are boiled over finally as we see clashes between Muslim gangs and also members of what is being termed as right-wing sects, although I think there's more to it than that. I think a lot of these people are simply fed up with the way their local communities are turning out.
I hear what you're saying, and I do agree because, let's be honest, the concerns regarding the failing of the migration policies are very legit. At the same time, it is also understandable that this violence is being condemned. What is your take on that?
Well, I think, violence by itself without a cause is always bad. And I think seeing the police getting caught in the middle of these violent riots, being attacked by both sides of the debate is absolutely unacceptable. I think that, the police force should be, at the end of the day, the ones who are upholding law and order rather than having to take it in the neck. But of course, there is an issue in this country with two-tier policing. There's been multiple examples over the last few days of Muslim gangs attacking, beating isolated white individuals simply on the basis of skin color, and the police haven't done anything about it. In fact, they've tried to play down those situations. Whereas when there have been instances of the opposite, where Asian or Muslim minorities have been targeted in these riots, the police have been very quick to crack down, and so there is a problem in the police force, which is that they don't want to be seen to be promoting quote unquote racism, and because of that, they are stirring tensions against themselves. Now, that still doesn't excuse the violence that's being perpetrated, of course, but you can understand why it is that tensions are so high at the moment. And the country simply feels like it's not being defended by its own police force and its own government. You've got Keir Starmer, of course, saying that the rioters are going to be dealt with, but absolutely refusing point blank to even talk about the problem that you've got the Muslim Defence League taking over parts of Birmingham, stopping traffic, walking around with machetes. And so there's this real kind of disjunct from the civil authorities about what the real issues are. And people don't feel understood or heard or safe. And so, they're turning to violence. That's not the right thing, in my opinion, because obviously it leaves the state open to snatching even greater power and taking control of the situation. But it's people's natural reaction, I think, when they feel unheard and unsupported by the authorities.
I hear what you're saying because, of course, your country has now to deal with changes they did not even choose for, and for a long time. There have been concerns about the current migration policies of your country. So, in a certain sense, it was inevitable that a riot would happen, given the fact that your politics have ignored literally the voice of the people for such a long time. Keir Starmer has been very harsh. What do you think is a better way he could approach this issue?
Well, he could have simply accepted that there is a problem that they have to deal with, which is the issue of mass migration, the issue of uncontrolled and unchecked, unvetted migrants, who, by the way, are accounting for a huge majority of the crimes being committed. We've seen rape go through the roof since the beginning of the mass migration policy under the Blair government in this country. Women have become much less safe. Like I said, there are now no-go zones, physical no-go zones in the case of places like Birmingham, where we've seen, as I mentioned, Muslim gangs stopping traffic, checking to see if people are white or not. There are areas, where essentially Sharia law is being enforced, and the police are very incapable and ill-equipped to deal with this kind of thing. The fact is that Keir Starmer needs to address those issues rather than just the issues of those who are rioting and committing criminal damage. I mean, there are two completely, tied in issues here, and he's refusing to look at both of them. He's only allowing himself to look at one. I think that's because he knows that, people see through the facade. They're not willing to listen to a government anymore on these matters. They've had false promises from consecutive governments for the past 15, 20 years, and they are beginning to get tired of the narrative. And so Starmer is using this opportunity to go full authoritarian, actually to seize more civil power and to try and crack down on the rights of not just protesters, but also ordinary people who are speaking out online, and saying that we want our country back.
As I say, never let a good crisis go to waste. I guess that was his motto when he decided to give his speech. Now, of course, we had elections the past months in Europe as well for the European Parliament, and what we saw in many countries is that there is this overall consensus of the concern dealing with the fact that we are having failed migration policies. Do you think that what's happening right now in the UK could be a precedent for the rest of Europe?
Well, I think in the UK we've been living pretty much in a bubble. In one sense, we know that this is a kind of salient problem. We occasionally have issues, perhaps, there's a stabbing or there's an issue where, someone burns the British flag and says that we're imperialists and that, actually Palestine is a more important issue than Britain. But we kind of live in a bubble in the sense that we haven't had the Bataclan, we haven't had the riots and the burnings that have happened in France. We haven't had a mass terrorist incident for some time. Obviously, there was the London Bridge attacks, but these are isolated incidents. They're not incidents that keep cropping up time and time again. Whereas in the continent, you have had a pretty sustained level of issue of attack, of rioting in France, for instance, for a long time now. And we're seeing that problem elsewhere in Europe, particularly in Germany, of course in Sweden as well, where migrants have been committing atrocities, particularly in instances of abuse against women, and of course in terms of stabbings and killings. The UK has been a relatively safe country. Of course, we have our own problems. We have gangs, etc. But we haven't seen this almost state of apartheid, which is breaking out on the streets between two clashing ethnic groups, the natives and the Muslims. And this is kind of the tipping point, I think, for not just the UK, but also particularly for the US. The US is responding to this because it sees, the UK as the tip of the Anglosphere. It sees it as, a narrative for what could happen in the US if the same problem continues to occur there. And I think, yes, in parts of Europe as well, perhaps in the Netherlands in particular, where you've had Geertz Wilders trying to outline this problem, people are now beginning to realize that this is what can happen at any point, really. It's always rumbling beneath the surface, and it's always just one incident away from rising into full-scale escalation.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for being with us here today. And of course, as our watchers are watching this, I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts are on these riots and when is enough enough? Like when are politicians finally going to listen to the fact that we need a different policy regarding migration? Thank you, Joseph, and thank you for our watchers.